The file was 11 seconds long. I had been governor of Sector 7 for 4 hours when I found it, not because it was hidden. It was buried under 200 years of low-priority administrative filings, tagged with a yellow border that meant, not urgent, not relevant, not worth your time. I almost agreed. The sector's previous administrator had left behind a filing system that looked like someone had organized it during a breakdown and then never returned to correct the damage. There were 600 open cases, a broken communication relay, and trade logs that stopped mid-sentence in entries dated a century ago. I had plenty of things to do that were not this file. Then I read the subject line. Survey Team Vel 9, last known transmission, Sol 3 contact event, status, unresolved. I am the third heir to the Velorian Imperium. The third. Not the first, not the second. The third, which means I have spent 247 years being perfectly composed, perfectly capable, and perfectly aware that capability is not the same as position. When my mother's illness became something the court could no longer pretend was temporary, they needed somewhere to put me. Sector 7 was their answer. One sector mostly empty, with one inhabited world on the far edge. Manageable, they said. A test of governance, they said. Their eyes said, go somewhere we do not have to watch you grieve. They gave me a sector with a 200-year-old quarantine that no one had bothered to review and called it a gift. Sol 3 had several unofficial names in the survey records. The researchers who had visited it kept writing Terra in their personal notes, though no official document used that word. The species on the surface was bipedal, carbon-based, pre-faster-than-light travel, and classified as a Class 4 primitive culture. There were 42 Class 4 worlds in the Imperium's surveyed space. I had governed 3 of them before this posting. I knew what to expect. That should have told me something that I thought I knew. I opened Annex 7 Omega. Survey Team Vel 9 had been sent on a routine cataloging mission 200 years ago. 6 researchers, 1 survey vessel, standard equipment. Their lead researcher had published 53 academic papers and had never once filed an incomplete report in her career. They were the best team available at the time. Their vessel's communication logs showed normal activity for 3 weeks after arrival. Then the logs ended. The final transmission was recovered by a search team sent out 3 weeks later. It had been broadcasting on a narrow frequency, just waiting to be picked up. It was 11 seconds long. I pressed play. I will not describe those 11 seconds in full. My audio analysis system spent a long moment processing the background sounds before categorizing them, with visible uncertainty, as environmental audio of unspecified origin. The lead researcher's voice was calm, very calm. The kind of calm that comes not from safety, but from having passed through fear and arrived somewhere else entirely. At the very end of those 11 seconds, she laughed. Not in panic, not in the way a person laughs when something has broken inside them. She laughed the way you laugh when a question you have been carrying for years finally shows you its answer, like the answer was simple, like she could not believe it had taken her this long to see it. Then the recording ended. I sat in my command chair, without moving for 4 minutes and 32 seconds. I know the exact duration because I checked my internal clock afterward, hoping less time had passed than I remembered. It had not. My aide, Velton, was standing 2 steps to my left. He had served me for 60 years. In those 60 years, he had watched me sit through 40-hour negotiations, govern 3 planetary disputes without raising my voice once, and deliver the news of a colonial trade collapse to a room full of hostile ambassadors without changing my expression. He was watching me now with the stillness of someone who has decided not to ask the question they already know the answer to. "Cue the next file," I said. "Yes, my lady." I did not sleep that cycle, not because anything had frightened me. I told myself this clearly and without hesitation. I did not sleep because the administrative backlog for a sector This badly managed was large enough to occupy every hour I had, and I was simply being thorough. In the morning, I pulled the full biological survey of Sol 3, 600 pages. The summary was 12 pages long, and I skipped it and went directly to the raw data, which I had learned was always more honest than the summary. Page 41 stopped me. The planet was what Valorian taxonomy called a death world. That classification exists. It is rarely used. A death world is a planet whose environment is so hostile to life that any species which manages to evolve there has done so by becoming something that standard biological models cannot easily describe. Sol 3's gravity was above Valorian standard. Its atmospheric pressure was higher. Its temperature ranges across a single solar cycle were wide enough to eliminate most known life forms. The planet had experienced 5 global extinction events in its recorded geological history. The species on the surface had outlasted all 5. That was not what stopped me. On page 41, in a margin note that had survived 200 years of archival processing without anyone removing it, the survey team's lead biologist had written, "They are soft. They should not exist here. Something is wrong with our models." She had underlined the last sentence twice. I read the remaining 559 pages. Then I sat quietly for a while and looked at the wall. Then I read the pages again. By the time I finished, one thought had settled clearly into place. The quarantine around Sol 3 had never been intended to protect the planet's surface from outside contact. That was how it had been filed. That was how it appeared in every official record. It was protecting everyone else from what was on the surface. I filed my arrival report to the Capitol. I listed infrastructure concerns, communication relay damage, trade route assessments. Everything a new sector governor is expected to list. Under Sol 3, I wrote, pending further observation. In 60 years of administrative work, I had never written those words. I told myself it was simply accurate. More data was needed. That was the responsible approach. Veltan appeared in the doorway. "My lady, there is a signal from the third planet." I looked up. "They have been transmitting on a standard Valorian diplomatic frequency for approximately 40 years, he said. He paused. In that specific way he pauses when he is about to say something he knows I will not enjoy. It appears no one informed them that we would not be responding. 40 years. They had been broadcasting into silence for 40 years and had not stopped. I looked at him for a moment. "Put it through," I said. The voice that came through my communication system was female, warm and startlingly direct. "Hello, this is Commander Kate Morgan of the Terran Defense Initiative. We've been trying to reach the local administrative authority for about 4 decades now, so if someone is actually listening to this, we would love to talk. We have a lot of questions. We also have coffee if that's something your species does. We genuinely do not know. Please respond at your convenience." I sat with that for a moment. Then I told Veltan to arrange a meeting. The preparation for first contact with a Class 4 species follows a set protocol. There is a checklist. I had followed versions of it 3 times before. The contact team is briefed on expected responses: awe, confusion, religious interpretation, possible panic. Primitive species, upon encountering a faster-than-light civilization for the first time, tend to respond in one of 4 documented ways. None of the 4 documented ways were on my mind when I walked into the neutral contact zone and saw the 6 humans waiting on the other side. The first thing I noticed was the animal. It was small, 4-legged, and covered in short brown fur. My scanner identified it as Canis lupus familiaris, a domesticated subspecies with no tactical function and no apparent diplomatic role. One of the humans was holding it against his chest with the casual ease of someone who had not considered, even briefly, whether bringing an animal to a first contact situation was standard procedure. The second thing I noticed was the hat. The human at the front of the group was wearing a soft cap with printed text on the front. My translator processed the text and returned, "World's okayest diplomat." I stopped walking for exactly 1 second. Then I kept walking. Because I was a princess of the Valorian Imperium, and I had governance to conduct. Commander Kate Morgan stepped forward. She was broad-shouldered, with lines around her eyes that came from years of squinting into difficult situations and deciding to find them interesting rather than alarming. She extended her right hand, palm facing down, fingers open. My translator identified it as a greeting gesture, physical contact, immediate, unprompted, offered to a head of state on first meeting. I took her hand. She had calluses. I noticed this immediately, the way you notice something specific when everything else around you is moving too fast to process. Valorian hands do not develop calluses. Our gravity is lower, our labor more automated, our culture more oriented toward things that do not roughen the skin. I had shaken hands with hundreds of diplomats, and none of their hands had ever felt like this. "Commander Kate Morgan," she said, "good to finally meet you. We were starting to think no one was home." "Princess Selavith Velkoron," I said, "Third Imperial Heir, Acting Governor of Sector 7. "That's a lot of titles." "Yes," I said, "it is." She smiled. It was the kind of smile that people use when they have already decided they like you and are waiting for you to catch up. Her team was introduced one by one. Dr. Mara Finch, a scientist with an expression of barely contained excitement that I would come to recognize as her standard resting state. General Ray Holt, who was carrying the animal and who shook my hand with the same easy confidence as the commander. 3 others whose names I logged and whose faces I was still processing. The animal was set down. It immediately moved toward me and pressed its nose against my boot. I looked down at it. "That's Biscuit," General Holt said. "He's friendly, he likes everybody." The animal looked up at me. I had no protocol for this. In 247 years of diplomacy, I had not once encountered a situation for which my training had not prepared some response. I had prepared responses for hostility, for reverence, for manipulation, for silence. I had not prepared a response for a small brown animal named Biscuit pressing its nose against my boot and waiting. "He will not harm you?" I asked. "He's never harmed anyone in his life," Holt said. "I think he'd apologize if he accidentally stepped on your foot." I looked at the animal for a moment longer. Then I looked away and returned my attention to Commander Morgan, because that was the professionally appropriate thing to do. The meeting that followed lasted 4 hours. In 4 hours, I learned things that were not in any file. The humans had been tracking Valorian ship movements for 30 years. They had reverse-engineered fragments of Valorian communication signals, using mathematics that my engineering officer later described as technically incorrect, but somehow producing accurate results. They had sent 40 years of diplomatic transmissions into silence without stopping because, as Commander Morgan explained, they had decided that patience was cheaper than giving up. They asked questions, hundreds of them, not cautious, deferential questions from beings who understood their position in the galactic order. Direct questions, curious questions, questions that assumed I would answer honestly because that was simply how conversations worked. What did the Imperium need from this sector? What were the trade conditions? Were there other species nearby? What were the Keth? Were the Keth dangerous? Were they more dangerous than the Valorians? Was I dangerous? That last question came from Dr. Finch. She asked it the same way she had asked about trade conditions, with genuine curiosity and no apparent awareness that it might not be a question one asked a princess. "That is not a standard diplomatic question," I said. "I know," she said, "but you've read our file, right? We stopped doing standard about a century ago. Are you dangerous?" I looked at her for a moment. Not to you, I said, provided we understand each other. She wrote something in her notebook. Commander Morgan produced food. This appeared to be non-negotiable. She laid it out on the table between us with the efficiency of someone who had decided this was happening regardless of what the other party thought, which was an approach I was beginning to understand was simply how these people operated. There were dishes from what she explained were different regions of the planet, each one prepared by different members of the delegation. She named them, one by one, with clear personal affection for each. I had attended 312 diplomatic functions. Food had been present at most of them. It had never been introduced by name before. This one, Morgan said, placing a container in front of me, is from Dr. Finch's grandmother. She made it the night before we left. She said it would make a good impression. Her grandmother knew we were meeting today. Her grandmother knows everything, Morgan said. We stopped questioning it. I tasted the food. I will not describe what happened next in detail. I am a princess. There are standards I maintain. I will say that I tasted everything on the table. The meeting ended as the light outside the contact zone shifted from gold to orange. The humans packed their containers and their equipment with the comfortable efficiency of people who were used to moving between unfamiliar places. Biscuit was lifted back into General Holt's arms. The team filed toward their transport. Commander Morgan stopped at the doorway. "Same time next week?" she asked. It was not how diplomatic schedules were set. There should have been a formal proposal, a written agenda, a communication through official channels. "Yes," I said. She nodded and walked out. I stood alone in the contact zone for a moment. Biscuit had been placed on the ground briefly during the meal. He had walked the perimeter of the room and eventually settled beside my chair, against my foot, and gone to sleep. I had not moved my foot for the remaining hour and a half of the meeting. I had told myself it was to avoid disturbing him. I was not sure I believed that. There is a Valorian word, Valthas. It means the moment something gets inside your careful distance without you noticing until it is already there. We use it as a warning, as a description of a mistake. I filed my contact report that evening. Under mood of the encounter, I wrote, productive. Under species assessment, I wrote, requires extended observation. Under recommendations, I left the field blank for a long time. Then I wrote, continue contact at weekly intervals. I did not examine why I had written it before the ink was dry. The Keth signal arrived 17 days into my governance of Sector 7. I knew what it was before I opened it. Keth communication signals have a particular frequency signature, sharp-edged and deliberate, like someone knocking on a door they intend to walk through whether you answer or not. I had seen 3 Keth border incidents in my career. I knew the pattern. A signal first, then a patrol, then a fleet if the signal went unanswered or was answered too softly. I opened the file. 3 Keth warships had crossed into the outer edge of Sector 7. They were moving along a trajectory that would take them through the sector's inhabited systems. At their current speed, they would reach Sol 3's orbit in 9 days. I pulled up the standard evacuation protocol for inhabited worlds in a contested engagement zone. Class 4 worlds are not evacuated. The protocol was clear on this. A pre-faster-than-light species cannot be relocated on a 9-day timeline. The procedure was to log the world's status, mark it as non-combatant, and flag it for post-engagement assessment. The Keth would almost certainly pass through without engaging a primitive world. There was no tactical value in Sol 3. There were no resources the Keth wanted from a world that had not yet developed the technology to know what resources were worth wanting. I drafted the communication to Commander Morgan. I explained the situation fully. I had been doing this since the first contact, being more transparent than protocol required, and I had stopped questioning the habit. I told her about the Keth fleet, their trajectory, their timeline. I told her that Valorian forces in the sector were repositioning to defensible coordinates. I told her that Sol 3 was not a target. I told her to shelter in place. I sent the message. Her response arrived 41 minutes later. She did not send a text communication. She called. Live video, open channel, no encryption. I stared at the incoming request for 1 full second before accepting it. Because an open channel call during a military alert was not something I had ever encountered, and my mind was briefly occupied with the question of whether this was intentional or simply how she operated under pressure. Based on everything I had learned in the past 17 days, it was simply how she operated under pressure. "Commander Morgan," I said. "Princess," she said. Behind her, I could see a room full of people in military uniforms who were all watching screens and moving with quiet, focused energy. "We got your message." "Good, then you understand the current situation." "We understand it," she said. "We've actually been tracking Keth fleet movements for about 30 years. We have data on their patrol patterns, their engagement tactics, their preferred approach vectors." She paused. "We've been preparing for something like this." Something about the way she said the last sentence made me pause. "Commander, I want to be very clear. Sector 7's defense forces are repositioning. This is a Valorian military matter. Your role is to remain on the surface and—" "We have ships," she said. I looked at her. "We have been building," she said. "Not fast ones, not elegant ones, but they are solid and they are crewed and they have been sitting in orbit waiting for the moment someone told us what was out there." She looked directly at the camera. "Tell us where you need us." I had given clear instructions. I had explained the situation, the protocol, and the expected outcome. I had done everything correctly, and the woman on my screen was looking at me with the calm certainty of someone who had already decided and was being polite by waiting for my response. "Commander Morgan, your vessels are not equipped for engagement with Keth warships." "Our vessels," she said, "have been designed by people who grew up on a death world and build things accordingly. Our engineering team would like you to not make assumptions about what we are equipped for." She said it without sharpness, not a challenge, a correction simply offered. Behind her, a man in a general's uniform was leaning back in his chair with his eyes closed. He appeared to be asleep. "Is that officer?" "That's General Holt," Morgan said without turning around. "He sleeps before a fight. It's not a problem. He's done it 11 times. I looked at the sleeping general for a moment. 11 times. "Put your vessels on the eastern flank of the engagement zone," I said. "Defensive positions only. You do not engage without my direct authorization." Commander Morgan smiled. "Understood," she said. "We'll be ready in 6 hours." The call ended. I sat at my desk and pulled up the structural reports on Terran vessels that my engineering team had managed to compile from long-range scans. My chief engineer had flagged the file with a note that read, "I am not sure how to write this report because I am not sure what I am looking at. The hull construction alone should not be functional. It is functional. I recommend we not assume anything further about these ships without direct examination." He had underlined that last sentence. I recognized the instinct. I sent a second message to Commander Morgan requesting the specifications of her fleet. She sent them within 20 minutes. My chief engineer read them for an hour. Then he came to my office and stood in the doorway with an expression I had not seen on him in 30 years of service. "My lady," he said, "these vessels were built by beings who assumed they would be hit and designed accordingly." "Yes," I said. "Valorian ships are designed to avoid being hit." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "These are very different design philosophies," he said. "They are," I said. "Get back to your station." He went, but he stood in the hallway for a moment first, and I was fairly certain he was thinking the same thing I was thinking, which was that somewhere in those design differences was a piece of information about these people that we had not yet finished understanding. The Keth fleet would arrive in 8 days. I ran the tactical simulations 7 times that evening. In 6 of the 7, the eastern flank held. The one where it did not was the one where the humans had followed my defensive positioning instructions exactly. I stared at that result for a long time. Then I deleted the simulation and ran it again with wider parameters. I sent Commander Morgan an updated tactical map at midnight. The message attached to it was brief. It said, "I have moved your positioning. You now have freedom of movement within the engagement zone. Please confirm you understand this means you may act on your own tactical judgment." Her response came back in 9 minutes. It said, "Understood. Thank you. Also, Biscuit wants to know if you are eating properly. He was asking about you this morning, which is unusual because he has never asked about anyone before." I read that message twice. I did not respond to the second part of it. I logged the tactical confirmation and closed the communication channel and went back to my simulations. But I kept the message open in a second window, off to the side, where I could see it while I worked. I told myself it was in case she sent a follow-up update about fleet positioning. I was not convincing myself. The Keth fleet dropped out of transit drive at the edge of Sector 7's inner boundary, at exactly the time my projections predicted. 3 warships, long, angular, dark, the kind of vessels that look like they were designed by beings who wanted the shape of the ship itself to communicate a message before a single weapon was fired. The Keth had been expanding their borders for 2 decades. They were good at this. They had done it to 11 other sectors, and in 9 of those 11 they had faced Valorian defense forces and negotiated terms within 48 hours. Because Valorian doctrine prioritizes preservation over prolonged conflict, and the Keth understood that and planned around it. They did not know about the humans on the eastern flank. No one had told them. I made a decision in that moment that I have since reviewed 100 times and reached the same conclusion each time. It was the correct decision. I did not tell the Keth about the Terran vessels in the engagement zone. They were there. If the Keth wanted to scan for them, they could. The decision not to disclose was not deception. It was simply allowing the situation to reveal itself. That is what I told myself. The Keth flagship broadcast a signal on a standard Valorian command frequency. It was a withdrawal demand, formal, structured, listing the terms under which Valorian forces could remove themselves from the sector without further engagement. I had received versions of this message in 2 previous Keth border incidents. The language was the same. The tone was the same. The certainty behind it was the same. The certainty of a party who has done this before and knows how it ends. The signal went out on an open frequency. Commander Morgan intercepted it. Her response arrived on the same open frequency before I could draft mine. 3 words. Yeah, no. I looked at my communications officer. He looked at me. The Keth flagship did not respond for 47 seconds. I later learned, from intelligence logs captured after the engagement, that the Keth command staff spent most of those 47 seconds trying to determine which Valorian faction had adopted the phrase "yeah, no" as a diplomatic position, and why, and what tactical doctrine it implied. Then the engagement began. My vessels held the center line as planned. The Keth pressed hard in the first exchange, and I lost 2 frigates in the opening minutes, which was within projected acceptable parameters. I was managing the tactical picture, calling adjustments, doing everything a sector governor in a military engagement is supposed to do. And then I watched the humans fight. Commander Morgan's fleet did not hold their designated positions for more than 4 minutes before they moved. They moved toward the Keth, not away. in a formation that my tactical system spent a long moment trying to classify before giving up and simply labeling. Approach vector, non-standard. The Keth's own tactical AI, based on the engagement patterns I reviewed afterward, made 3 separate attempts to predict the human fleet's next movement and was wrong each time. Valorian vessels are built to be fast and precise, to strike at specific vulnerabilities and withdraw before taking significant damage. It is an effective doctrine. It is the doctrine of a species that values its personnel and builds its strategy around protecting them. The Terran vessels absorbed 3 direct Keth strikes and kept moving. My chief engineer sent me a private message mid-engagement that read simply, "The hull plating on those ships. I cannot explain the hull plating on those ships." I did not respond because I was watching the tactical display, and something else had caught my attention. One of the human vessels, designation Echo 7, was broadcasting on an open crew channel. It was not broadcasting orders or tactical information. The crew was singing. Not loud, not in a way that overwhelmed communications, but my audio monitoring picked it up clearly, a low, rhythmic sound coming from a ship that had just absorbed a glancing hit to its port side and was responding by singing. I looked at Velton. He looked at me. Neither of us said anything. The second Keth warship made a hard push toward the center of the formation, which was the expected response to pressure on the eastern flank. It was a textbook move. I had seen it simulated dozens of times. I had already positioned a response. The response landed cleanly. What I had not positioned a response for was what happened next, which was that the Keth's flagship, in the middle of a coordinated engagement it had been designed to win, went completely silent. Not tactically silent, communication silent. Every broadcast, every internal relay that my monitoring equipment could reach went quiet. For 19 seconds. I did not understand it in the moment. I ran the tactical projections forward, and they did not account for it. A fleet does not go silent in the middle of an engagement unless something has changed the nature of the engagement in a way the commander had not prepared for. 19 seconds of silence. Then the Keth flagship broadcast a single signal to its 2 accompanying vessels. Retreat vector. They were leaving. The battle was not over by any tactical measure. Both sides had sustained damage. The engagement zone was still contested. There was no military reason, no strategic calculation, no doctrine I could identify that explained why a Keth fleet in a winnable position turned and ran. I sat at my command console and looked at the retreating ships on my display, and I understood something then that I could not put in any official report. Something had frightened them. Something they had not expected to find in Sector 7 had frightened the Keth fleet badly enough to abandon a tactical position they could have held. I looked at the human fleet spread across the eastern display. Echo 7 was still singing. My monitoring equipment picked up the last few seconds of it as the Keth ships completed their retreat vector. One voice, clear and unworried, like someone finishing a thought that had been interrupted by something minor. I pulled the full engagement logs for Echo 7. The singing had started approximately 11 minutes into the fight when the ship took its second strike and the structural reports began showing real damage. It had continued through the third strike, through the damage alerts, through the section of the fight where, by every calculation I ran, the probability of the ship's crew surviving had dropped significantly. The Keth flagship had gone silent 19 seconds after the singing began. I sat with that for a long time. The cleanup took 4 hours. My vessels swept the engagement zone and confirmed the Keth had fully withdrawn. I filed the preliminary report to the capital. I listed the fleet movements, the tactical summary, the outcome. I listed the damage assessments on both Valorian and Terran vessels. Under notes I wrote, Terran forces performed outside projected parameters, full analysis pending. Then I looked at the singing for a long time in my notes. I deleted it. Not because it was not relevant, because I did not yet have the language to explain why it was the most important thing that had happened in the entire engagement. Commander Morgan called an hour later. She looked tired. The good kind of tired, the kind that comes after something difficult has been completed. "We held," she said. "You held," I agreed. She looked at me for a moment. "You okay?" I thought of several correct answers. I had a list of them, ordered by diplomatic appropriateness. "I am processing the engagement data," I said. She nodded slowly. Then she reached forward, and for a moment her hand was visible on the screen, and I found myself thinking about Calluses again. "Get some sleep," she said. "Biscuit sends his regards." The call ended. I did not get some sleep. I sat at my console until the early morning hours of the next cycle, reading Echo 7's logs and thinking about 11 seconds, and thinking about a survey researcher who had laughed at the end of her final transmission, and finally, quietly, understanding exactly what she had understood in that moment. They were not frightening because they were powerful. They were frightening because they did not behave like things that understood they could lose. And there is no tactical response to that. There is no doctrine that addresses it. You cannot outmaneuver something that has looked at the possibility of the worst outcome and decided not to accept it, but to sing at it. The Keth had understood that in 19 seconds. It had taken me 247 years and one engagement log to understand it. I added one more line to my report before I closed it. I recommend immediate reclassification of Sol 3. Under species classification, I wrote Category Omega. Then I closed the file and looked out at the dark beyond the station's viewports and thought about a dog named Biscuit who had never harmed anyone in his life and who had sat on my foot and gone to sleep like I was a safe place to be. I was not sure if I had earned that. I thought that maybe, if I stayed long enough, I might. The summons from the imperial capital arrived 3 weeks later. I had been expecting it. The Keth incident had not been quiet. 3 Keth warships retreating from a single sector without completing their engagement was the kind of event that moved through Valorian intelligence channels at speed, and the kind of event that prompted questions that required answers from the governor who had presided over it. I had prepared my full report. I had prepared supplementary data. I had prepared, for the first time in my career, for a debrief that I was not entirely sure how to conduct. The capital looked exactly as it had when I left. That was the first thing I noticed as my vessel descended through its upper atmosphere. The city spread beneath me in careful, luminous order. The great administrative spires, the Imperium's central gardens, maintained at a level of precision that required a full dedicated staff. The court's outer halls, visible from the air as a long curve of pale stone, unchanged since the reign of the 4th Empress, unchanged since the days when the Imperium had been smaller and the known galaxy had felt more manageable. It was beautiful. I sat at my window and looked at it and felt, for the first time, like I was returning to a room I had never noticed had no windows. I did not examine that feeling. I put it in the same internal space where I kept the log of Echo 7 singing and the survey researcher's laugh and the memory of Calluses, and I filed it under, to be processed later when there is time, when the right words arrive. The court had assembled a review committee. 7 senior members, the Imperium's leading voices on border security, species classification, and diplomatic affairs. They were serious, composed, and they had read my preliminary report with the careful attention of beings who had reached the same section of data I had reached and were trying to find a framework for it. The first question came from the committee's chair. "The Keth withdrew," he said, "from a tactically favorable position." "Yes." "And your assessment of the cause?" I had prepared several answers for this question. carefully worded answers that moved the conversation through the tactical data without stopping too long at the part I had no good language for. I used none of them. They encountered something they did not have a response to, I said. The Terran forces engaged in a manner that fell outside Keth doctrinal expectations. Their behavior during the engagement was inconsistent with any species classification the Keth had previously encountered. Inconsistent how? They did not respond to damage the way any known species responds to damage, I said. They continued to engage. They communicated in ways that were not tactical. They appeared to treat the engagement as a situation to be navigated rather than a crisis to be survived. The committee was quiet. A Class 4 species, the chair said carefully. They were Class 4 by the criteria we used at the time of the original survey, I said. I have recommended reclassification, Category Omega. The room shifted, not physically. That small, collective tension that moves through a group of people when something large arrives without announcement. Category Omega had not been assigned in 600 years. There were beings on the committee who had been alive 600 years ago and had never seen the classification used. That is a significant recommendation, someone said. Yes, I said, it is accurate. The debrief continued for 4 more hours. I answered every question. I provided every piece of data I had. I was thorough and precise, and I left out the singing, not because it was not relevant, but because I had not yet found the words that would make a committee understand why an unencrypted audio log of a crew singing during active combat was, in my assessment, the most strategically significant piece of information to come out of the entire engagement. I would find those words eventually. I was still working on them. When the session ended, I was escorted to my mother's chambers. The Empress's rooms were in the oldest section of the palace, where the walls were thick enough to hold warmth through the cold season without mechanical assistance, and the light came through windows that had been placed by an architect who understood that the angle of light in the morning should feel like a decision, not an accident. I had grown up in those rooms, in and out of them my whole life, sitting at my mother's feet while she worked, learning governance by watching rather than being taught. She was smaller than I remembered. The illness had been doing that for 2 years, compressing her, taking things from her in small amounts so that the change was always gradual enough to argue with until one day it was not. She was sitting up in her chair by the window when I came in, which I knew had required effort, because she always sat up when I arrived. She had never once greeted me lying down, in 247 years. I did not know if that was love or pride or if, for her, those had always been the same thing. Her eyes had not changed. They were still the color of deep space, still the eyes that had read every truth I was trying to say and everything I was trying not to say with equal ease. Sit, she said. I sat. Tell me what they are like, she said. Not tell me the tactical assessment. Not, give me the reclassification rationale. Not, explain your decision-making during the Keth engagement. She had read the official report. She had read everything I had filed. She wanted what was not in the report. She always knew. I thought about the full answer, all of it. Every piece of data, every observation, every documented anomaly from the biological surveys and the contact meetings and the engagement logs. I thought about the 600 pages of the biological survey and the note in the margin on page 41 and the survey researcher's 11-second transmission and the sound of Echo 7 singing through damage alerts. I thought about where to start. They are inefficient, I said. My mother waited. Catastrophically inefficient, I said. No psychic ability. Fragile, comparatively. They require sleep every single cycle without exception, and if they do not get it, they become non-functional in ways that are remarkably quick by any biological standard. They require regular food intake at intervals that would be considered excessive by our nutritional models. They have complex emotional response systems that they do not suppress, and that affect their decision-making in ways that should, by any rational analysis, make them less effective. My mother's expression did not change. She was listening the way she always listened, completely, without rushing me toward the point she could already see. Their ships are built on principles that my chief engineer described as theoretically incorrect and practically functional. Their diplomatic protocols are entirely informal. At every meeting they produce food and expect you to share it. They brought an animal to our first contact. The animal went to sleep on my foot. I stopped. And my mother said. Outside the window, the capital was settling into its evening arrangement. The light was doing what the architect had intended, falling at an angle that felt like a decision. They lost personnel in the engagement, I said. One crew, one vessel, Echo 7. I had memorized the name the way I memorized things that mattered. They held a memorial on the surface 3 days later. I attended. My mother waited. Commander Morgan stood beside me. She did not speak for a long time, then she asked if I was all right. I looked at my hands for a moment. Smooth hands, Valorian hands, hands that had never developed calluses because nothing in my life had ever required it. No one has asked me that since you became ill, I said. Not once. In 2 years. The room was very quiet. And are you? My mother asked. I thought about the honest answer for a long time. Long enough that the light outside the window shifted slightly, moving through its evening progression toward the darker hours. I was thrown back 5 years, I said. When she asked, to the morning you told me about the diagnosis. I was standing in a foreign system next to a human commander I had known for less than a month, and she asked if I was all right, and I remembered that morning very clearly. My mother looked at me, her deep space eyes, the eyes that had governed an empire and raised 3 children and read every truth before it was spoken. What did you tell her? I told her I was processing the engagement data, I said. My mother made a sound, small, almost without volume. If she had been anyone else, I would have called it a laugh. What did she do? She put her hand on my arm, I said, and she left it there. She did not say anything else. The room held that for a moment. She sounds like someone worth knowing, my mother said. Yes, I said, she is. My mother was quiet for a while. Her breathing was careful in the way that careful breathing gets when it has become something deliberate instead of automatic. I watched her and did not say what I was thinking, which was that I had spent 2 years filing governance reports from a distant sector and not coming home, and the distance had felt, while I was in it, like the responsible choice. Like staying away meant I was not watching her get smaller. She would know that too. She always did. I want to ask you something, I said. Ask. The Category Omega recommendation. The committee will debate it. Some members will argue that elevating a pre-FTL species to that classification changes our obligations toward them, our resource commitments, our strategic positioning in the sector. They will argue it is premature. Yes, my mother said, they will. Is it wrong? I asked. The recommendation, is it the wrong call? She looked at me for a long time. You tell me, she said. You were there, I was not. I thought about a fleet retreating at speed from a ship that was singing. I thought about a laugh at the end of 11 seconds. I thought about a biologist's margin note on page 41, underlining something she needed herself to remember. No, I said, it is not the wrong call. Then defend it, she said simply. You are very good at defending things you believe. She said the last sentence in a tone I did not hear often, not the Empress's tone, something older than that. I stayed until she fell asleep. She fell asleep in her chair by the window the way she had been doing since the illness began, quickly, without ceremony, in the middle of a thought. I sat with her for a while after, looking at her face, which was still hers, still entirely hers, regardless of what the illness had done to the rest. Then I went back to my quarters, and I wrote the supplementary report that the committee had requested. It was 30 pages long. On the last page, under the section titled Strategic Relevance of Terran Species Classification, I wrote the following. The Keth retreated not because they were outgunned. They were not outgunned. They retreated because they encountered a species that does not organize itself around the avoidance of loss. In my assessment, every known military doctrine in the surveyed galaxy, including our own, is built on the assumption that all parties value preservation enough to eventually choose withdrawal over destruction. The Terrans do not operate from this assumption, not because they do not value life. The evidence strongly suggests they value it enormously, but they appear to have made a separate calculation, somewhere in their history, about what they are willing to pay to protect the things they care about. And that calculation does not have a ceiling that I have been able to identify. The Keth found the edge of that in 19 seconds. I am recommending we do not find it at all. Category Omega is not a threat classification. It is, in my view, the most accurate description of an ally. I submitted the report at 2 in the morning, and then I sat at my desk for a long time in the quiet of the Capitol, before I finally did something I had not done in 2 years. I drafted a personal communication, not a diplomatic communication, not a governance update. I wrote, "The committee approved the reclassification pending full review. I will return to Sector 7 at the end of the week. I wanted you to know before the official announcement." Then I looked at the message for a moment and added one more line. "I also wanted to tell you that your grandmother's food was the best thing I ate at any diplomatic function in my career, and I would like the recipe if she is willing to share it." I sent it before I could decide that was not an appropriate thing for a princess to request. Her response came back in 6 minutes. She said, "Grandmother says of course she will share it. She also says it is about time someone over there asked. Also, Biscuit has been sitting by the communication console every evening since you left. I do not know how to explain that to you scientifically, but I thought you should know." I read the message 3 times. Then I closed my console and went asleep for the first time in what felt like weeks. Real sleep, the kind that comes when the thing you have been carrying has been set down somewhere safe. I returned to Sector 7 4 days later. Commander Morgan met me at the landing site. She was standing at the edge of the platform with her hands in her pockets and the look of someone who had decided to be there early and was comfortable with that decision. Behind her, Dr. Finch was talking to 2 of my staff with her notebook out, already asking questions. General Holt was there too. He was holding Biscuit. Biscuit saw me. He made a sound, short, clear, immediately recognizable as something enthusiastic. Holt put him down and he moved across the landing platform in a straight line toward my boots. He pressed his nose against my boot. Then he sat down and looked up at me. I looked down at him for a long time. This small brown animal who had no tactical value and no diplomatic function, and had traveled to a landing platform to sit beside a Valorian princess's boot like that was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Commander Morgan stopped next to me. She did not say anything for a moment. She looked out at the sector the same way I had started looking at it, like it was something worth the attention. "Welcome back," she said. "Thank you," I said. Biscuit settled against my foot. I did not move. This is not in any file. Some things earn their place in the space between the reports, in the quiet after the meetings, in the weight of a sleeping animal who has decided, without any evidence you gave him, that you are a safe place to be. Some things are not about governance. Some things are just true. I looked out at Sector 7 and the star above it and the planet on the edge of the display, the planet that had survived 5 extinctions and was currently experiencing a period of relative stability, and I thought, I am going to learn their language, not the translated version, the real one. The one that has a word for grandmothers who make food for diplomatic missions they will never attend, and pilots who sing through damage alerts, and small animals who wait by communication consoles in the evenings for no reason they can explain. I have been a princess of the Valorian Imperium for 247 years. I have never, in all of that time, wanted to learn a language before. I am starting tomorrow.